I think the play you've just witnessed is really a remarkable play, and we'll talk a little bit about its production history and so on, such as it is. But to see this play resurrected after so many years is really a remarkable thing. It's a remarkably subtle piece of work. You will have noticed just a few minutes ago on this stage, just after the character of Nan made her last exit, she's off stage for a few moments. James and Kate are on stage, and there's an off-stage sound effect. It's very subtle, but it's there in the script. It's a door slamming. And Kate says to James, what was that? And James just says, oh, that was Nan. She's going for her dinner. And I couldn't help but think, when I heard that door slam off stage, of that famous door slamming in Ibsen's A Doll's House. Yes. And I think it occurs to me that this is not just purely coincidental, because in the 1920s, in the Abbey Theatre, there were a series of productions of Ibsen's A Doll's House, and they were directed by a man named Lennox Robinson. Now, friends of the Mint will know Lennox Robinson, because on this very stage last year, there was a production of his play from 1933, Is Life Worth Living? Robinson was a very committed Ibsenite. And throughout the 1920s, from 1926 onwards up to about I think it was 31, every October he produced a production of A Doll's House. So A Doll's House was a play that was very much on the Abbey stage in those years. I think one of the things that suggests to me is that running like a sort of current, like a kind of subterranean current through the Abbey in those years is something that is almost a kind of subversive commentary on things that are going on in Irish society. Now, Deevy comes to the Abbey just really at the point at which its glory years are starting to fade. That the Abbey is founded, as I'm sure you probably know, in the first decade of the 20th century. The Irish Literary Theatre really begins life 1897. The Abbey itself starts 1904, and it comes out of nowhere in lots of ways, and it starts with a bang. So that within its first decade, from 1900 to about 1910, we have a whole series of major writers appearing and creating an Irish tradition. And in retrospect, people like, say, Lady Gregory, when they're writing their memoirs, will say, we created an Irish theatre. So you have people like John Millington Synge, Riders to the Sea. For me, I think the best short play in the English language, 1904. Playboy the Western World, one of the great plays of last century that is constantly revived, 1907. You have Yeats, Nobel laureate, writing for the theatre. You have Shaw had an uneasy relationship with the theatre, but John Bull's Other Island makes it nonetheless. Then when you get into the 1920s, you get the plays of Sean O'Casey, that great Dublin trilogy, which is an astonishing piece of work, engaging with events that have just happened. It's dealing with the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War and the 1916 Rising, those three plays from the mid-1920s, The Plough and the Stars, Shadow of the Gunman, and Juno the Paycock. One of the things that makes this period, say from about 1900 to say 1926 with The Plough and the Stars, so powerful and so fascinating for more than doors slamming off stage this afternoon. What makes this so fascinating for people like myself who are theatre historians is you have a period there in Irish theatre history where theatre is not just entertainment, it's not just a night out, it's something else. It is part of an attempt to create a national culture. And that's a very, very heavy legacy for any writer to deal with. Now, Teresa Deevy is growing up all the years that this is happening at the Abbey. But she comes in just at the end of it. She submits her first play to the Abbey in 1928, 2 years after Sean O'Casey's Plough and the Stars, produces a riot, produces controversy, and O'Casey leaves, goes to England, and never comes back. So in a sense, Deevy is coming in at the end of something. And she's coming in at the end of a period that is not only extraordinarily creative and productive in terms of theatre, but which sees itself as revolutionary. So So she submits her first play to the Abbey in 1928. Lennox Robinson, our friend, reads it. There's all sorts of connections here, which I find fascinating. You know, the fact that Robinson was performed here in this theatre last year, and yet there's the connection between Robinson and Deevy. He reads the play, he rejects it, and then he gets back in touch with Deevy, encourages her, and then she continues to send plays to the Abbey. A series of plays follow after that. Just to get the actual dates right on this, there was a play called The Reapers. Was the first one that was actually accepted by the Abbey in 1930. It was followed by a play called The Disciple, to give you the exact date, August of 1931, Temporal Powers, 1932, King of Spain's Daughter, 1935, Katie Roche, 1936, and The Wild Goose, 1936. Quite a remarkable series of plays, all accepted by the major national theatre. The other thing, just incidentally, that Deevy starts to do toward the end of the 1930s is that her plays become adapted for television. That the BBC begins broadcasting in 1939. Now they stop again very quickly because after September 39, it becomes apparent that television signals are very good for bombers to guide themselves by, so they turn it off. But there's a brief period of television broadcasting in the late 30s, and they start broadcasting some of her plays, actually. And it was another Irish playwright, Dennis Johnson, who produced some of them. That's just a footnote. So what we have then in the 30s is Deevy's work being accepted in the Abbey at this period when the Abbey is trying to figure out where it goes next, trying to figure out what kind of theatre it is. Lennox Robinson once wrote around this period, he said that the Abbey, he said, was like a blade that had a knife that had 7 new blades and 6 new handles and still called itself the same knife. That there was this sense of legacy, this sense of having come from these great events of the first decade of the 20th century, and then, what do you do afterwards? How do you create something sort of after that? Well, one of the things that was starting to happen in the mid-1930s in the Abbey was that there was a kind of political power struggle going on. Lady Gregory dies in 1932, Yeats dies in 1939. The Abbey, control of the Abbey increasingly moved to a series of figures who had been appointed by the government. The Irish state gave the Abbey a subsidy, made it the first state-subsidized theatre in the English-speaking world in 1926. And the person who gradually assumed control of the Abbey in the 1930s was a former Minister for Finance, funnily enough, a man named Ernest Blythe. And Blythe saw the role of the Abbey in those years as being mainly to dampen down the kind of idealism, the kind of enthusiasms that had been generated by the first couple of decades of revolutionary activity in Ireland. So Deevy comes into the Abbey at a time when it's reinventing itself in a very conservative vein. And I think I want to use this as a way of thinking about how she writes about women. Now, it's certainly the case that Deevy wasn't happy about the direction the Abbey was taking. And here's a letter, this is a manuscript letter from a collection of her letters. It's in the National Library of Ireland, the manuscript collection, where she writes to a friend of hers, Florence Hackett, in 1935. It says, "Something will have to be done about the theatre in Ireland. It's appalling." And later that year, she recounts a conversation she had with the Irish writer Frank O'Connor, where she says, "Frank O'Connor says the Abbey's finished, but I don't agree." Deevy, apart from anything else, was a woman who didn't go out of her way to ingratiate herself to men in power. So we have this figure, Ernest Blythe, taking over the Abbey, former Minister for Finance. What does Deevy do? She takes up a position, very publicly, protesting against government censorship. She writes a letter to the Irish Times, 1936. "Who are the censors?" she demands. "By what right do they hold office? And how, in case of proved incompetence, can they be removed?" Now, just on the basis of that alone, I think you could see how she is moving herself, I suppose, positioning herself away from the center of things. Whatever the case, what happens is the Abbey begin to turn their back on her. In 1939, she has a play called Holiday House, accepted by the Abbey, a contract signed, and the play is never produced. And whenever she asks what happens, she gets what she's, according to her correspondent, she says, evasive replies. Now it's around this time that she's starting to write the play that you saw this evening, Wife to James Whelan. So she's coming out of this period of having been extraordinarily successful, of putting herself in opposition to the sort of powers that be in the Abbey, and then she's starting to write this play, Wife to James Whelan. And I think one of the things that we perhaps see, the kind of conflicts you just saw on this stage between women and men with power, are perhaps some of her reflections on some of the things she's starting to experience in this period of the mid-30s.